Well, Rose, let me tell you something my mother always told me. The size of your dreams should never be determined by anyone else's expectations. Being a mother doesn't mean giving up on your dreams. It means having someone else to dream for too. Later that afternoon, sitting on the Supreme Court bench listening to oral arguments, Michelle felt her baby kick. She placed a hand discreetly on her belly, thinking about all the changes 6 months had brought. Judge Harrison's mentorship program had sparked similar initiatives across the country. The young attorneys she'd inspired were now inspiring others. And somewhere in that high school group today might be a future justice, seeing their own possibilities reflected in her presence on the bench. During a break between cases, Michelle received a text from David with their latest sonogram picture. Under it, he'd written, "Future justice in training. But first, maybe we should get through the terrible twos." She smiled, thinking about how life had a way of bringing everything full circle. 6 months ago, she'd walked into a courtroom where people underestimated her. Now she sat on the highest court in the land, her very presence changing perceptions and opening doors. That evening, as she prepared to leave for the day, Michelle's phone buzzed with another message. It was from Lisa Chen. "You'll never believe it. I just won my first major case." The judge actually quoted your housing rights argument from that day in Judge Harrison's court. "Thank you for showing us all what's possible." Michelle gathered her things, thinking about all the lives that had been touched by that one day 6 months ago. Judge Harrison had learned to see beyond his biases. The clients from her housing case had kept their homes. Young lawyers like Lisa were finding their voices in courtrooms across the country. As she walked down the Supreme Court steps in the fading light, a tourist stopped her. "Justice Johnson, would you mind taking a picture with my daughter? She wants to be a lawyer when she grows up." The little girl looked up at Michelle with wide eyes, clutching a book about the Supreme Court. Michelle knelt down to her level, her robe pooling around her. "What's your favorite subject in school?" she asked the girl. "I like arguing," the girl declared, making her parents laugh nervously. Michelle grinned. "You know what? I started out just like that. Keep arguing. Just make sure you have good reasons to back it up." As she posed for the picture, Michelle thought about all the photos like this that would be treasured in family albums, inspiring future generations. She thought about her own child, who would grow up knowing that anything was possible. The sun was setting behind the Capitol dome as Michelle made her way home. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new challenges, new opportunities to ensure justice for all. But tonight, she would call her parents, have dinner with David, and maybe look through that old diary her mother had found. After all, some dreams do come true, not just for yourself, but for all those who come after you, dreaming their own big dreams in small restaurants, crowded classrooms, and busy courtrooms across America. 6 months had passed since that transformative day in Judge Harrison's courtroom. The marble halls of the Supreme Court echoed with Michelle's footsteps as she walked toward her chambers, her black robe flowing behind her. The weight of responsibility felt both heavy and right on her shoulders. "Good morning, Justice Johnson," called out one of the clerks, hurrying past with a stack of briefs. Michelle smiled at the title. She still wasn't completely used to it, even after 3 months on the bench. Her chambers were exactly as she'd left them the night before, except for one new addition. On her desk sat a small package wrapped in brown paper. The return address was from the county courthouse where everything had changed half a year ago. Opening it carefully, Michelle found a framed photograph and a letter. The photo showed Judge Harrison standing with his first class of mentees from the diversity program he'd started. 20 young faces beamed at the camera, their eyes bright with possibility. Michelle recognized Lisa Chen among them, standing tall and confident. The letter was in Judge Harrison's familiar handwriting. "Dear Justice Johnson, I thought you might like to see the fruits of the seeds planted that day in my courtroom. Our mentorship program has expanded to 3 other districts, and we're receiving inquiries from courts across the country. But more importantly, I wanted you to know that your example has changed more than just these young lawyers' lives. It's changed how I see the world. Yesterday, I had a young attorney in my courtroom, her first major case. Before your day in my court, I might have seen only her inexperience, her gender, her race. Instead, I saw her potential, her preparation, her passion for justice. You were right about change happening one conversation at a time. Respectfully, William Harrison." Michelle placed the photo on her shelf next to her family pictures. Her mother's restaurant was now famous. People came from all over to eat at the Supreme Court Justice's parents' place. Her father had finally retired, though he still went in every day to supervise and tell customers proud stories about his daughter. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Her law clerk entered, carrying a stack of newspapers. "I thought you might want to see these, Justice Johnson. They're running stories about your first 100 days on the court." Michelle glanced at the headlines. Justice Johnson's early impact on the Supreme Court. New justice brings fresh perspective to highest court. Historic appointment leads to meaningful change. But what caught her eye was a small story in the local section of her hometown paper. It was about a career day at her old high school, where a record number of students, especially girls and minorities, had expressed interest in legal careers. Also, her clerk added, "The school group is here for their tour. They're asking if you might have a few minutes to speak with them." Michelle checked her watch. She had oral arguments in an hour, but yes, she said, "Tell them I'll meet them in the Great Hall." Walking out to meet the students, Michelle was struck by their faces, eager, nervous, diverse. They reminded her of herself at that age, daring to dream big dreams. "Good morning," she began, and the students instantly fell silent, hanging on her every word. "I'm guessing some of you might want to be lawyers someday." Several hands shot up immediately. One girl, who couldn't have been more than 15, raised her hand and asked, "Is it true that a judge once told you to review basic law the same day you were nominated to the Supreme Court?" Michelle smiled. "Yes, that's true. And you know what? That moment taught me something important. Sometimes people will underestimate you. They'll look at you and see only what they expect to see. Your job isn't to prove them wrong. Your job is to be so good they can't ignore you." A boy in the back raised his hand. "Did you always want to be on the Supreme Court?" "Actually," Michelle replied, "what I always wanted was to make a difference. The court is one way to do that, but there are many others. The important thing is to find what you're passionate about and pursue it with everything you have." As she spoke with the students, Michelle noticed one girl who seemed particularly engaged. She was pregnant, probably in her last year of high school, taking detailed notes just like Michelle used to do. After the other students had moved on with their tour, this girl lingered behind. "Justice Johnson," she said hesitantly, "everyone tells me I should give up on college because I'm having a baby. But seeing you here, knowing you're going to be a mom too." She trailed off, placing a hand on her belly. Michelle thought about her own baby due in just 2 months. "What's your name?" she asked. "Rose," the girl replied. "And did it work?" her father asked, amused. "We're picking up a rescue puppy next weekend," David admitted. They all laughed, and for a moment it felt like any other family dinner. The weight of the Supreme Court nomination, the media attention, the upcoming confirmation hearings, all of it faded away in the warm comfort of her parents' restaurant. As they ate, customers kept appearing at the door despite the CeeLo ZD sign, peering in and waving when they spotted Michelle. Her parents had been fixtures in this community for decades, and their daughter's success felt like everyone's success. "Oh," her mother suddenly exclaimed. "I almost forgot." She hurried to the back and returned with a small worn notebook. "Look what I found while cleaning last week." Michelle opened it and gasped softly. It was her childhood diary, filled with her teenage dreams and ambitions. On one page, in careful handwriting, she had written, "Today I watched a lady lawyer on TV. She looked so strong and smart. Maybe one day I could be like that." And now, her father said proudly, "Little girls will watch you on TV and write the same thing in their diaries." Michelle felt tears welling up in her eyes. Her mother immediately started fussing. "No crying. Crying makes the soup too salty," but she was wiping her own eyes as she said it. David squeezed her hand under the table. "Should we tell them?" he whispered. Michelle nodded. "Mom, Dad, there's one more piece of news. I was going to wait, but you're going to be grandparents." The restaurant erupted in joyful chaos. Her mother burst into tears, her father knocked over his water glass, and David grinned like he'd been wanting to share this secret for weeks. "A baby and the Supreme Court," her mother exclaimed. "Now you really must eat more." As her mother rushed to the kitchen to pack up leftovers, you need good food now more than ever, Michelle looked around the restaurant. This small family business had put her through college and law school. Every dollar earned from every bowl of soup had helped fund her dreams. And now, sitting in the same booth where she'd once studied for the LSATs, she was a Supreme Court nominee. "A lot of reporters have been asking about my inspiration," she said to her father. "They want to know about my legal heroes, my role models in the profession. But the truth is, my biggest inspiration has always been right here. You and Mom showed me what courage looks like. What it means to face prejudice with dignity, to work hard not just for yourself, but for something bigger." Her father squeezed her hand, too emotional to speak. From the kitchen, they could hear her mother singing an old song from their homeland, something she only did when she was extremely happy. Tomorrow would bring press conferences, preparation meetings, and the beginning of the confirmation process. But tonight was for family, for remembering where she came from, and for celebrating not just how far she'd come, but how far they'd all come together. The smell of her mother's cooking hit Michelle the moment she opened the door to her parents' restaurant. The familiar aroma of ginger, garlic, and her mother's secret spice blend brought back a flood of childhood memories. The Stilos DD sign hung in the window. Her parents had shut down early to celebrate. "My baby." Her mother rushed from behind the counter, still wearing her apron. Even at 70, she moved with the energy of someone half her age. She wrapped Michelle in a tight hug, then held her at arm's length to examine her face. "You look tired. Have you eaten anything today?" "Leave her be, honey," Michelle's father called out, emerging from the kitchen. His eyes were red-rimmed. He'd clearly been crying again. "Our daughter is going to be on the Supreme Court, and you're worried about whether she had lunch." The restaurant looked exactly as it had when Michelle was growing up. The same red booths lined the walls, though the vinyl was a bit more worn now. Family photos covered one wall: Michelle's graduations, her parents' citizenship ceremony, the day they'd first opened the restaurant 35 years ago. A new photo would soon join them, one taken in front of the Supreme Court. "Come, come," her mother urged, leading her to their usual booth, the one where Michelle had spent countless hours doing homework while her parents worked. "I made all your favorites." Her husband David was already there, having arrived straight from his office. He stood up to kiss her cheek. "The conquering hero returns," he teased gently. "I saw your press conference online. You were amazing." Michelle's mother disappeared into the kitchen and returned pushing a cart loaded with dishes. Steam rose from bowls of noodle soup, plates of dumplings, and all the comfort foods Michelle had grown up with. "Ma, this is too much," Michelle protested, but her mother was already filling her bowl. "Too much? My daughter is going to be a Supreme Court justice. Nothing is too much." Her mother's voice caught slightly on the word justice, and she quickly wiped her eyes with her apron. "Tell us everything," her father said, sliding into the booth. "How did it feel when that judge realized who you were?" "Your mother and I watched it all on TV. They had reporters outside the courthouse." Michelle blew on her soup to cool it. "Actually, I want to hear how you two handled the news. The restaurant must have been buzzing all day." Her parents exchanged glances. "Well," her father began, "Mrs. Lee from next door came running in around 11, screaming about seeing you on TV. Then everyone started calling and coming in. We had to close early because we couldn't focus on cooking." "The phone hasn't stopped ringing," her mother added. "Everyone wants to congratulate us. Mrs. Chen, you remember her, Lisa's mother? She cried when she called. Said her daughter called from law school, so excited she could barely speak." Michelle smiled, remembering the young law student she'd met at the courthouse. "I met Lisa today, actually. She was there with some other students." "See," her mother said triumphantly. "This is why we always pushed you to work hard. Not just for yourself, but for all the other little girls who needed to see it was possible." Speaking of which, David interjected, pulling out his phone. "You should see what's happening on social media. Your press conference has gone viral. People are sharing their own stories of facing discrimination in their careers." Michelle's father reached across the table to hold her hand. "You know what makes me proudest?" he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not the nomination, though that's incredible. What makes me proudest is that you stayed true to yourself. You didn't let that judge's behavior change who you are." "I learned that from you too," Michelle replied softly. "Remember when people used to tell you to change the restaurant's menu? Make it more American? but you stayed true to your cooking, and now people come from all over the city for your food." Her mother nodded vigorously while piling more dumplings onto Michelle's plate. "Yes, yes, never change who you are for others. Now eat, eat. You need strength for all the interviews tomorrow." Just then, Michelle's phone buzzed. It was Jen. "Sorry to interrupt family time, but thought you'd want to know. Judge Harrison just announced a new mentorship program for minority law students. He cited today's events as his inspiration. You're already changing things." Michelle showed the message to her family. Her father beamed with pride, but her mother just nodded knowingly. "Of course you are changing things. That's what you've always done, since you were a little girl arguing about bedtime like a lawyer." David laughed. "She still does that, by the way. Last week, she presented a 3-point argument about why we should get a dog." As people began filing out of the courtroom, the young girl from the back row approached the counsel table, clutching her notebook. Her mother hung back, looking apologetic for the interruption. "Excuse me, Miss Johnson," the girl said shyly. "I want to be a lawyer too. Could you sign my notebook?" Michelle looked at the girl's notebook and saw that she had been taking detailed notes throughout the hearing, complete with little drawings of the courtroom. "What's your name?" she asked, taking the notebook. "Maria," the girl replied. "I've never seen a lawyer who looks like me before." Michelle wrote a message in the notebook. "To Maria, never let anyone tell you where you belong. The courtroom is waiting for your voice. Dream big and work hard. Michelle Johnson." As she handed the notebook back, Judge Harrison approached the counsel table. "Miss Johnson, a moment." Michelle nodded to Maria and her mother, who thanked her and left the courtroom. Judge Harrison waited until they were alone before speaking. "I've been on this bench for 3 decades, he began, "and I've seen thousands of attorneys argue cases before me. But today was different. Not because of your nomination, but because you made me see my own biases clearly for the first time." Michelle listened quietly as he continued. "I've always prided myself on being fair and impartial," he said, "but this morning showed me that I've been carrying prejudices I didn't even recognize. Your response to my inappropriate behavior was a masterclass in professionalism and dignity." "Thank you, Your Honor," Michelle replied. "We all have biases. The important thing is recognizing them and being willing to change." "Indeed," he nodded, "which is why I've decided to start a mentoring program for young attorneys from underrepresented backgrounds. Would you be willing to speak at the launch event? After your confirmation, of course." Michelle smiled. "I'd be honored, Your Honor. Change happens one conversation at a time." As she gathered her things to leave, Jen appeared at her side. "Ready to face the media again?" "They're still camped out front." Michelle looked at her watch. It was only 3:30 p.m., but it felt like days had passed since she walked into the courthouse this morning. "Actually," she said, "I think we'll use the back exit this time. I promised my parents I'd come over for dinner, and my mom will worry if I'm late." As they walked through the quiet back corridors of the courthouse, Michelle thought about how much had changed in a single day. But more importantly, she thought about how much hadn't changed: her commitment to justice, her dedication to her clients, her belief in the power of the law to protect the vulnerable. The afternoon sun was warm on her face as they stepped outside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: confirmation hearings, media scrutiny, and all the pressure that came with being a Supreme Court nominee. But for now, she was looking forward to her mother's cooking and her father's proud smile, to being just their daughter for a few hours. After all, even future Supreme Court justices needed their mother's homemade soup once in a while. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the courtroom windows as Michelle made her way back to the counsel table. The gallery was now packed to capacity, filled with curious onlookers who had heard about the morning's events. Even the usual courthouse staff had found excuses to slip into the back of the courtroom, eager to witness history in the making. "All rise," the bailiff called out as Judge Harrison returned to the bench. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted dramatically from the morning session. Gone was the judge's condescending demeanor, replaced by an almost nervous energy as he adjusted his robes and cleared his throat. "Please be seated," he said, his voice noticeably gentler than before. "Ms. Johnson, are you prepared to continue with your arguments?" Michelle rose gracefully from her chair. "Yes, Your Honor. As I was saying before the recess, the harm to our clients is immediate and irreparable." The afternoon session proceeded with a markedly different tone. Judge Harrison listened attentively, his interruptions now limited to genuinely clarifying questions rather than patronizing comments. The opposing counsel, a young attorney named Peter Richardson, seemed unsure how to handle the changed dynamics. "Your Honor," Peter began, his voice slightly shaky, "while we certainly respect Ms. Johnson's impressive credentials." He glanced nervously at Michelle, clearly thrown off by the knowledge that he was arguing against a Supreme Court nominee. "Counsel," Judge Harrison interjected, "perhaps we should focus on the merits of the case rather than anyone's credentials." Michelle hid a small smile. It was a remarkable turnaround from the judge's own behavior this morning. As she rose for her rebuttal, Michelle noticed a small girl sitting in the back of the courtroom with what appeared to be her mother, probably a courthouse employee who had brought her daughter to witness this historic day. The girl couldn't have been more than 10, and she was watching Michelle with wide-eyed attention, scribbling furiously in a small notebook. "Your Honor," Michelle began, "the opposition's arguments about economic hardship to the developers pale in comparison to the human cost of displacement. We're talking about families who have lived in these neighborhoods for generations, children who will have to change schools mid-year, elderly residents who will lose their support systems." She gestured to the exhibits displayed on the courtroom screen. "These aren't just statistics, Your Honor. These are people's lives. The developers' profit margins might be affected by a delay in construction, but our clients face the loss of their homes, their community, their very sense of belonging." The young girl in the back was now leaning forward in her seat, completely absorbed. Michelle remembered being that age, watching a female attorney argue a case in her local courthouse, dreaming of one day standing in a courtroom herself. She hadn't dared dream of the Supreme Court back then. It had seemed as distant as the moon. Furthermore, Michelle continued, her voice strong and clear, the precedent set in the Wilson case clearly establishes that economic inconvenience alone cannot outweigh fundamental housing rights. I would direct the court's attention to Justice Rodriguez's opinion, where she specifically addresses. As she spoke, Michelle could see her words landing differently than they had this morning. The same arguments that Judge Harrison had dismissed hours ago were now being received with thoughtful nods. The law hadn't changed since morning, but perception had. "Ms. Johnson," Judge Harrison said when she finished, "your arguments are well-reasoned and compelling." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I am prepared to rule from the bench." A murmur ran through the courtroom. It was unusual for Judge Harrison to make immediate decisions, especially on complex motions like this one. This court finds that the plaintiffs have met their burden for preliminary injunctive relief. The proposed development is hereby stayed pending full hearing on the merits. Ms. Johnson, please prepare the order." The gallery erupted in quiet applause, quickly silenced by the bailiff's stern look. Michelle's clients, seated in the front row, were crying and hugging each other. She turned to give them a reassuring smile. This was why she did this work, Supreme Court nomination or not. This answer seemed to surprise the reporters, and Michelle could see them furiously scribbling notes. She knew it wasn't the typical response they expected from a Supreme Court nominee, but it was the honest one. "Thank you all for your time," she concluded. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have clients waiting." As she turned to head back inside, a small commotion near the courthouse steps caught her attention. A group of young law students, still in their business attire from their internships, had gathered to watch. Among them was a young woman who looked just like Michelle had 15 years ago, determined, hopeful, and perhaps a bit uncertain about her place in the legal world. Michelle paused and walked over to the group. The young woman's eyes widened as Michelle approached. "What's your name?" Michelle asked. "Lisa Chen," the student replied, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm a second-year law student. I never thought I'd see someone like me nominated to the Supreme Court." Michelle placed a gentle hand on Lisa's shoulder. "Remember this moment," she said softly. "And remember that the door doesn't just open for you. It opens for everyone who comes after you. Keep studying, keep working hard, and most importantly, keep believing in yourself." As Michelle walked back into the courthouse, she could hear the excited chatter of the law students behind her. She smiled, remembering her own days as a student, dreaming of making a difference in the world. Jen fell into step beside her. "That was amazing," she said. But you know what the best part was? You didn't let all this, she gestured at the media circus, change who you are. You're still putting your clients first. Speaking of which, Michelle checked her watch. We should get back to court. Judge Harrison's probably ready to reconvene, and we have an injunction to win. As they walked through the now quiet hallways, Michelle's phone buzzed with a message. It was from her mother. We just watched you on TV. Your father's crying. So proud of you, baby. Remember to eat lunch. Michelle smiled, tucking the phone away. Some things never changed, Supreme Court nomination or not. Her mother would always worry about whether she was eating enough. Judge Harrison would probably still struggle with his biases, though hopefully less now, and she would always put her clients first. The afternoon sun streamed through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Michelle straightened her jacket and took a deep breath. She had briefs to present, arguments to make, and justice to fight for. The headlines could wait. Right now, she had work to do. The courthouse lobby had transformed into a media circus by the time Michelle stepped off the elevator. Camera flashes lit up the marble halls like lightning, and reporters were clustered around every exit, their microphones extended like eager hands reaching for a story. There she is. Someone shouted, and suddenly all eyes turned toward her. Michelle straightened her shoulders, channeling the same calm confidence she'd shown in the courtroom just hours earlier. Her assistant Jen appeared at her side, somehow managing to create a path through the crowd. "The back exit's clear," she whispered. "Security's waiting to escort you out." But Michelle shook her head slightly. "No," she said quietly. "We're going to do this right." She approached the podium that had been hastily set up near the courthouse steps. The sea of reporters parted before her, and for a moment, the chaos settled into an anticipatory hush. Michelle caught sight of Ray, the security guard from this morning, beaming with pride as he helped maintain order. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady and clear. "I understand you all have questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. But first, I want to say something." The cameras zoomed in closer, and Michelle could see her own image reflected in their lenses. She thought about all the little girls who might see this moment on their TV screens tonight, and she knew exactly what she wanted to say. "This morning, I came to this courthouse just like I have for the past 15 years, ready to fight for justice, ready to represent my clients, ready to do the work. That hasn't changed. The president's nomination is an incredible honor, but it doesn't change who I am or what I believe in." She paused, letting her words sink in. Her reporter's hand shot up. "Ms. Johnson, how does it feel to be nominated to the Supreme Court?" Michelle smiled. "It feels like a responsibility. A responsibility to uphold the Constitution, to protect the rights of all Americans, and to ensure that our justice system works for everyone, not just some of us." "Can you tell us about your conversation with the president?" Another reporter called out. "What I can tell you is that we share a deep commitment to the rule of law and equal justice under that law. But right now, I'd like to talk about something else." Michelle's voice took on a warmer tone. "I'd like to talk about my parents, who came to this country with nothing but hope and determination." The crowd grew quieter, sensing a story. "My father worked 3 jobs to put food on our table. My mother ran a small restaurant and studied English at night. They taught me that education and hard work were the keys to any door. But more importantly, they taught me that dignity isn't given to you by others, it's something you carry within yourself." From the corner of her eye, Michelle could see Judge Harrison standing at a window above, watching the scene unfold. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave her a small, respectful nod. "Ms. Johnson." Another reporter waved frantically. "What would you say to young people who face discrimination in their professional lives?" Michelle thought carefully before answering. "I tell them what my mother always told me. Excellence is the best response to low expectations. But I'd also tell them something I've learned over my career. That change doesn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it comes in small moments, in daily interactions, in refusing to let others' prejudices define you." Just then, Michelle spotted a familiar face in the crowd, her husband David, who must have rushed over from his office downtown. His eyes were shining with pride, and she could see him mouthing the words, "You got this." "One more question," Jen announced to the crowd. A young reporter, probably fresh out of journalism school, stepped forward. Ms. Johnson, earlier today you were arguing a civil rights case before Judge Harrison. Will you continue with your current cases during the nomination process? Absolutely, Michelle replied without hesitation. In fact, I need to return to the courtroom soon to finish presenting my arguments. My clients deserve nothing less than my full commitment, today and every day until my last day practicing law. The judge winced, but Michelle continued. The difference isn't in whether it happens, but in how we handle it. I've always believed that the best response to prejudice isn't anger or resentment, but excellence. That's why I make sure I know every case, every precedent, every possible argument inside and out. And you do, Judge Harrison admitted. Your arguments today were, well, they were exceptional, even before I knew about your nomination. The nomination doesn't change who I am or what I know, Michelle said quietly. It just changes how people perceive it. Judge Harrison was silent for a long moment. You know, he finally said, I have a granddaughter. She's in her second year of law school. When she told me she wanted to be a lawyer, I was thrilled. But I wonder how many times she's faced the same kind of treatment I showed you today. It's not too late to be part of the change, Michelle responded. Every time we recognize our biases, we have an opportunity to do better. The judge nodded slowly. Would you be willing to speak to my law clerks? Not today, of course. You'll be rather busy with the confirmation process. But perhaps before you head to Washington. I think they could learn a great deal from you. I know I have. Michelle smiled. I'd be happy to. After all, change happens one conversation at a time. Just then, there was a knock at the door. The clerk poked her head in. I'm sorry to interrupt, but the press is gathering in the lobby, and the president's office is on line 1. Of course, Judge Harrison stood up. You must have 1,000 things to do. But Ms. Johnson, Michelle, thank you, not just for this conversation, but for handling everything with such grace. The Supreme Court will be better for having you on it. As Michelle stood to leave, the judge added, Oh, and regarding your motion. I'll have my decision by the end of the day. Based on the merits of your arguments, of course. Of course, Michelle replied with a small smile. Thank you, Your Honor. As she left the chambers, Michelle could hear phones ringing throughout the courthouse. Reporters were already gathering in the lobby, and her own phone was buzzing constantly with messages of congratulation. But her mind was already on her next case. After all, she hadn't become who she was by letting other people's perceptions, positive or negative, define her. The day that had started with condescension was ending with celebration, but Michelle knew the real work was just beginning. As she walked back to the courtroom where Jen was waiting, she thought about all the young lawyers who would come after her, hoping that her story would make their path just a little bit easier. The critical moment had arrived. As Michelle stood at the podium facing Judge Harrison, the courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, but Michelle's voice remained steady and clear as she continued her argument. Your Honor, if we look at the impact on the community, Michelle began, but Judge Harrison raised his hand to interrupt her yet again. Ms. Johnson, I really must insist that you focus on the fundamental legal principles here. Perhaps you're not familiar with the Baker precedent. He peered down at her with that same condescending smile he'd worn all morning. At that exact moment, phones throughout the courtroom began buzzing simultaneously. The sound was like a swarm of bees, growing louder as more and more devices lit up with the breaking news. Judge Harrison's clerk, who had been diligently taking notes, suddenly sat up straight, her eyes widening as she read something on her computer screen. The clerk quickly scribbled a note and handed it to the bailiff, who rushed it up to Judge Harrison. Michelle could see the exact moment he read it. His face went from its usual ruddy color to a shade of pale she hadn't thought possible. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he set the note down. I know. For perhaps the first time in his 30-year career on the bench, Judge Harrison seemed at a loss for words. He cleared his throat and tried again. We'll take a 15-minute recess. As the judge practically fled from the bench, the courtroom erupted into barely contained chaos. Lawyers who had been observing from the gallery were now huddled over their phones, whispering excitedly. The opposing counsel, who had spent the morning looking increasingly uncomfortable with Judge Harrison's treatment of Michelle, was now staring at her with a mixture of awe and embarrassment. Jen approached Michelle's table, practically bouncing with excitement. They're announcing it everywhere, she whispered, showing Michelle her phone. The headline blazed across the screen. President nominates Michelle Johnson to Supreme Court, civil rights attorney set to make history. Michelle allowed herself a small smile as she gathered her papers. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on her, but she maintained her composure. This was exactly why she hadn't told anyone about the nomination. She wanted to be judged on the merits of her arguments, not on her upcoming position. Ms. Johnson? The bailiff appeared at her elbow. Judge Harrison would like to see you in his chambers. Michelle nodded, straightening her jacket. She turned to Jen and handed her the case files. Would you mind waiting here? This shouldn't take long. The walk to Judge Harrison's chambers felt surreal. Court staff who had barely noticed her before were now smiling and nodding as she passed. A young law clerk actually dropped her files when Michelle walked by, scrambling to pick them up while stammering congratulations. Judge Harrison's chambers were exactly what you'd expect: dark wood paneling, leather-bound law books lining the walls, and a massive desk that seemed designed to intimidate. But today, the man sitting behind that desk looked anything but intimidating. He had removed his judicial robe and looked somehow smaller, more human. Please, sit down, he said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs in front of his desk. His voice had lost its usual authoritative tone. I believe congratulations are in order. Michelle sat down, smoothing her skirt. Thank you, Your Honor. I must say, he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with his words. I find myself in the rather uncomfortable position of owing you an apology. My behavior this morning, indeed my behavior over many mornings, has been— Your Honor, Michelle interrupted gently. I didn't come in here for an apology. No, but you deserve one nonetheless. Judge Harrison removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. I've been on this bench for 30 years, Ms. Johnson. I've seen thousands of attorneys come through my courtroom, and I realize now that I've been seeing what I expected to see, rather than what was actually in front of me. Michelle leaned forward slightly. Judge Harrison, may I speak frankly? He nodded, looking relieved at the opportunity to stop talking. What happened in court today? The condescension, the interruptions, the suggestions that I review basic law, that's not unique to you or this courtroom. I've faced it my entire career. So have countless other attorneys who don't fit the traditional image of what a lawyer should look like. Ms. Johnson, Judge Harrison interrupted yet again, his frustration becoming more apparent. I'm concerned that you might be missing some fundamental concepts here. Perhaps you might want to review basic constitutional law before your next appearance. I can recommend some excellent primers. A muffled gasp came from somewhere in the gallery. Even the opposing counsel was now staring at his legal pad, clearly mortified. But Michelle remained unruffled, standing tall in her navy blue suit, her expression professional and composed. Thank you for your concern, Your Honor, she replied smoothly. I always appreciate opportunities for continued learning. Now, regarding the constitutional implications of our motion. As she continued her argument, Michelle was acutely aware of the sealed letter in her briefcase, sitting just a few feet away. The same letter that would, in a few hours, announce her nomination to the highest court in the land. The irony of Judge Harrison suggesting she review constitutional law wasn't lost on her, or on Jen, who was now hiding a smile behind her hand. The hearing continued, with Judge Harrison growing increasingly frustrated as Michelle calmly and competently countered each of his attempts to undermine her arguments. She cited cases that even he hadn't thought of, drew connections that made the law clerks scribbling in the corner look up in appreciation, and maintained her composure despite his constant interruptions. Your Honor, Michelle said, wrapping up her argument, the precedent is clear. The harm to our clients is immediate and irreparable. Every day this injunction is delayed, more families face displacement from their homes. The balance of equities clearly favors. Yes, Judge Harrison waved his hand dismissively. I'm familiar with the standard boilerplate arguments in these types of cases. Though I must say, Ms. Johnson, your grasp of the subtleties of constitutional law remains concerning. Just then, a court officer hurried into the room and whispered something to Judge Harrison's clerk. The clerk's eyes widened, and she quickly passed a note to the judge. As he read it, his face went through a remarkable series of transformations, from confusion to disbelief to something approaching horror. Michelle knew what that note must contain. The president's announcement had been scheduled for 11:00 a.m. A quick glance at the clock on the wall showed 11:07. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, suddenly looking very different from the confident, dismissive man who'd been lecturing her moments before. We'll take a brief recess," he announced, his voice slightly hoarse. "Ms. Johnson, would you please see me in chambers after the break?" As the courtroom erupted in murmurs and the sound of phones buzzing with news alerts, Michelle calmly gathered her papers. She'd won many victories in this courtroom over the years, but somehow this moment felt particularly significant. Not because of her imminent appointment, but because perhaps, just perhaps, it would help Judge Harrison and others like him recognize that excellence in law comes in all forms. "Michelle," Jen whispered urgently, holding up her phone with the breaking news headline. "It's out." Michelle nodded, maintaining her professional demeanor even as she felt the weight of history settling on her shoulders. She had a feeling her upcoming conversation with Judge Harrison would be very different from their previous interactions. But first, she had a motion to win and clients to represent, because that's who she was, Supreme Court nomination or not. Inside courtroom 302, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Michelle Johnson had barely settled her files on the counsel table when Judge Harrison's clerk announced, "All rise." The rustling of suits and skirts filled the air as everyone stood for the judge's entrance. Judge William Harrison swept into the courtroom with the air of someone who'd occupied the bench for far too long. His steel-gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses gave him an appearance straight out of central casting for traditional federal judge, and his reputation preceded him like a storm cloud. At 68 years old, he'd been presiding over cases since Michelle was in elementary school, and his views hadn't exactly evolved with the times. "Be seated," he commanded, adjusting his reading glasses as he peered down at the day's docket. His eyes narrowed slightly when they landed on Michelle's name. She'd appeared before him numerous times over the years, but his reaction was always the same, as if seeing her name was somehow unexpected. "We'll begin with Johnson versus Metro Development Corporation," Judge Harrison announced, his voice carrying that particular tone he seemed to reserve for certain attorneys, particularly those who didn't fit his mental image of what a lawyer should look like. Michelle rose smoothly from her chair, her motion papers organized perfectly in front of her. "Good morning, Your Honor. Michelle Johnson for the plaintiffs." "Ms. Johnson," Judge Harrison said, emphasizing the Ms. in a way that made it sound like a diminutive rather than a title. "I trust you're prepared to explain why your motion for preliminary injunction shouldn't be dismissed outright." A few younger attorneys in the gallery shifted uncomfortably at his tone. They knew Michelle's reputation, her brilliant arguments before the circuit court, her perfect record in civil rights cases, her numerous awards from the State Bar Association. But Judge Harrison spoke to her as if she were a first-year associate who'd wandered into the wrong courtroom. "Yes, Your Honor," Michelle replied, her voice steady and professional. "If I may direct the court's attention to the Supreme Court's decision in Thompson v. West Ridge, where Justice Kennedy specifically addressed." "Ms. Johnson," Judge Harrison interrupted, removing his glasses and pinching the bridge of his nose. "Perhaps before we delve into Supreme Court precedent, we should review some basic principles of civil procedure. Are you familiar with the four-part test for preliminary injunctions?" The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. Behind Michelle, her assistant Jen was gripping her pen so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The opposing counsel, a young white man fresh out of law school, looked deeply uncomfortable. Michelle took a slow, deliberate breath. She'd faced this kind of treatment countless times before, and she knew exactly how to handle it. "Yes, Your Honor. The four factors are likelihood of success on the merits, irreparable harm in the absence of preliminary relief, balance of equities tipping in the plaintiff's favor, and the public interest. If I may, I'd like to address each factor systematically, beginning with our substantial likelihood of success." Well, Judge Harrison cut in again, leaning back in his chair. "Someone's done their homework. But tell me, Ms. Johnson, have you considered the implications of the Roberts Court's recent decisions on standing requirements?" A small smile played at the corners of Michelle's mouth. If he only knew that just yesterday she'd been discussing those very cases with the President's Judicial Selection Committee. Instead of showing any reaction, she calmly opened a folder and pulled out a brief. Indeed, Your Honor. On page 17 of our brief, we specifically addressed the standing requirements as outlined in both the Roberts Court decisions and the more recent Martinez case. If you'll notice, we've included a detailed analysis of how our plaintiffs meet each element of the modified standing test. For the next 20 minutes, Michelle masterfully presented her arguments, citing cases from memory, addressing each of the judge's increasingly technical questions with precision and clarity. The gallery had grown fuller as word spread through the courthouse that something interesting was happening in Judge Harrison's courtroom. Furthermore, Your Honor, Michelle continued, her voice clear and confident, the Ninth Circuit's analysis in the Rodriguez case directly supports our position that, as she walked toward Judge Harrison's courtroom, Michelle thought about all the young lawyers she'd mentored over the years, especially those who, like her, had faced countless barriers because of their race or gender. She thought about the letter in her briefcase and how its contents would soon change not just her life, but potentially the lives of generations to come. Checking her watch, 9:45 a.m., Michelle took a deep breath. In 15 minutes, she would walk into that courtroom as she had hundreds of times before. But today was different. Today, she carried with her not just the weight of her cases, but the knowledge that soon she would be making history. The courthouse was starting to buzz with its usual morning energy. Lawyers rushing between courtrooms, clients nervously waiting on benches, clerks darting back and forth with stacks of papers. Michelle nodded hello to familiar faces, exchanged quick waves with colleagues, and stopped briefly to give directions to a lost-looking law student. Standing outside courtroom 302, Michelle did what she always did before entering. She thought of her parents, of their sacrifice and determination, of all the people who had fought to make it possible for someone like her to stand where she was standing. Then, with quiet confidence, she pushed open the heavy wooden doors, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Little did Judge Harrison know, the attorney he was about to underestimate would soon be making headlines across the nation. But for now, Michelle was focused on one thing, being the best advocate she could be for her clients, just as she had been every other day of her 15-year career. This was just the beginning of what would prove to be an extraordinary day, one that would remind everyone that sometimes the most powerful moments in history happen on seemingly ordinary Tuesday mornings. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the county courthouse, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor. It was 7:45 a.m., and Michelle Johnson was already walking through the security checkpoint, exchanging warm smiles with Ray, the security guard she'd greeted almost every morning for the past 15 years. Another big day ahead? Ray asked, handing back her ID badge. Just like any other Tuesday, Michelle replied with a knowing smile, adjusting her navy blue blazer. But this wasn't just any Tuesday, and the weight of the sealed letter in her briefcase reminded her of that fact. As she made her way toward the elevator, her heels clicking against the floor, she couldn't help but think about how far she'd come. Growing up in a small apartment above her parents' restaurant in Detroit, she'd spent countless nights studying by candlelight when they couldn't afford to pay the electricity bill. Her mother's words still echoed in her mind. Education is the one thing they can never take away from you. The elevator doors opened to the third floor, and Michelle stepped out, breathing in the familiar scent of old books and coffee that seemed to permanently linger in the air. Her assistant, Jen, was already at her desk, organizing case files with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing this job for years. "Morning, Michelle. I've got your coffee right here. 2 sugars, splash of almond milk," Jen said, holding out the steaming cup. "And the Thompson case files are ready for review." Michelle took a sip of the perfectly prepared coffee and smiled. "What would I do without you, Jen?" "Probably still using that ancient coffee machine in the break room," Jen chuckled, following Michelle into her office. The morning light filtered through the Venetian blinds, highlighting the framed diplomas on the wall: University of Michigan undergrad, Yale Law School, various awards and recognitions. But Michelle's favorite item in her office wasn't any of these prestigious certificates. It was a worn-out photograph of her parents at their restaurant's grand opening, their faces beaming with pride despite the challenges they faced as immigrants building a new life. As she settled into her chair, Michelle's hand unconsciously went to her briefcase, where the sealed letter sat. Just yesterday, she received it from the president's office. The memory of that phone call still felt surreal. "Ms. Johnson, the president would like to speak with you." She hadn't told anyone yet, not even Jen. The only people who knew were her parents, who had cried tears of joy over FaceTime last night, and her husband, David, who had immediately gone out to buy champagne but promised to keep it corked until the official announcement. Opening her laptop, Michelle began reviewing the day's cases. She had 3 court appearances scheduled, including a crucial civil rights case she'd been working on for months. The Harrison courtroom was first on her list, a fact that made her both sigh and straighten her shoulders. Judge Harrison was known throughout the courthouse for his traditional views. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. It was Tom from the public defender's office. "Hey Michelle, got a minute? I need your thoughts on this housing discrimination case." "Of course, come in," she gestured to the chair across from her desk. This was what she loved most about her job, being able to help not just her clients, but also other attorneys fighting the good fight. As they discussed the case, Michelle couldn't help but notice the morning news playing silently on Tom's phone, showing footage of the Supreme Court. In just a few hours, everyone would know. But for now, she was simply doing what she had always done, working hard, helping others, and staying true to her principles. The morning wore on, and Michelle prepared for her appearance in Judge Harrison's courtroom. She double-checked her citations, reviewed her arguments, and gathered her materials with the same meticulous attention to detail that had earned her a reputation as one of the state's finest civil rights attorneys. "Ready for battle?" Jen asked, handing her an extra pen, their little ritual before every court appearance. "Always," Michelle replied, standing up and smoothing her skirt. She caught her reflection in the window, a woman in her mid-40s with warm brown skin and eyes that held both determination and kindness. Her mother had always told her to dress like she was meeting the president, advice that had served her well throughout her career. Today, though, she had to suppress a laugh at the irony of that particular piece of wisdom.